Imam, a Taoist master, a guru, Buddhist guru, and a Christian walk into a bar. It's not a joke. The barman turns to this group of 5 religious people and says, "Well, tell me, what's so special about the guy who started your religion?" The rabbi replies, "Oh, our guy gave us the 10 Commandments." The Imam says, "Well, our guy delivered the final revelation from God, the Quran." The Taoist master says, "Well, our guy taught us how to live in harmony with nature." And the Buddhist guru says, "Our guy found enlightenment that ends suffering." The Christian goes last and says, "Our guy died." It's not a punchline, is it? And yet it's the heart of the Christian faith. How could the death of Jesus possibly be good news? There is no good reason to doubt that Jesus lived and died. Even the most sceptical of the experts on this part of history agree that there was really a man from Nazareth called Jesus. He had a band of followers who followed him around, that he died and was crucified as a criminal by the order of Governor Pontius Pilate. That's what the experts today tell us. That's what the secular historians of the time tell us. The Jewish historian Josephus and Roman historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny and others, they all talk about Jesus. And they are all absolutely certain that Jesus died. If you were trying to start a movement, though, a religious movement or a political movement, would you make the death of its founder the launching pad? Surely that would be the bit that we would hide. And yet as we come to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, they all mention his death. They all mention that it was by crucifixion. And in fact, all of them make the death and resurrection of Jesus the centre point of their book. In John's Gospel, out of his 33 years of life and 3 years of ministry, John mentions only 21 individual days. And half of the book is dedicated to the last 7. From the middle of John's Gospel, it is all about his arrival in Jerusalem that will culminate in his crucifixion. These words are the words of an eyewitness, of John himself, who tells us in verse 35 that he's the man who saw this and he's given testimony and he knows that it's true. And at the end of verse 35, he says, he testifies so that you also may believe. Here is the heart of the good news. Here is the thing that we must grasp hold of by faith. What to any other movement would be the beginning of the end, for Jesus' followers is the real start, is the reason that we are here nearly 2,000 years later. The death of Jesus is not a tragic footnote at the end of his biography that is unfortunate and to be forgotten about. His death is the foundation of all that he's come to do. And so, because Jesus has died, you and I can trust him to cleanse us, to make us clean. That is John's point in these verses. And it's what no other way of living, no other religion can ever offer to us. If we have in Islam the final revelation of God, that cannot bring us closer to a God who in Islam is unknowable. If we have only God's law in its most perfect form, that cannot change me or you to make us able to keep that. If our parliaments pass perfect laws, would it make it any easier for us to obey them? No, it wouldn't. And so it is with God's law. If we can sit under a tree and meditate for long enough to come into harmony with nature, that doesn't solve our rebellion against the Creator of it. And if we find peace within ourselves, that doesn't put us at peace before the all-knowing God, to whom we all stand guilty. What we need is to be made clean. What we need is to be forgiven. What we need is to be born again and given new life. We need someone who can deal with our sin and our shame and our separation from God and give a new life where we only have guilt and death. Friends, this is why Jesus has died, and it's why his death is not just nice. It is the best news. It's the news our friends, our families, and each one of us need. We can trust Jesus, who died to make believers clean. That's the point of where we're going today. If you only remember one thing when you walk out the door, or when you wake up on Monday morning, trust Jesus, who died to make believers clean. That's where we're going here in John 19, 31 to 37, because we all face the question of what we will do with Jesus. Look first of all at verses 31 and 32, where we see what the Romans and the Jews do with Jesus. They see him as condemned and as contaminating. And you've got the points there in the bulletin. That's good here. Find that helpful as we work our way through. The Romans find Jesus condemned, and the Jews see him as contaminated. The Romans are the ones in charge of Jesus' execution. They see him as a condemned man. In the verses running up to this, if we could have read from late in chapter 18, we would have seen at least 3 times that the Roman governor, Pilate, declares Jesus innocent. Chapter 18, verse 38, and then twice here in chapter 19, verses 4 and 6. Yes, you take him and crucify him, Pilate says. As for me, I find no basis even for a charge against him, alone for his condemnation. And yet Pilate still hands him over as a traitor, someone who claimed to be a rival to the emperor, Caesar. Being condemned in a Roman court meant you had no rights. There was no Supreme Court to appeal to, especially if you weren't a Roman citizen. And so Jesus was immediately sent out of the city to be crucified. A crucifixion is the ultimate punishment. It was reserved for slaves, for rebels, for enemies of the state. And its aim was not simply to bring about death. There are much more efficient ways to do that. This way of dying was about shame and suffering. It was about total humiliation for the person condemned to die. And it could often take days. And when the criminal finally did die, their bodies were usually tossed on the rubbish heap or just left to hang until they could hang no more, with a loud and brutal warning to all who would go past, this is what happens when you defy Rome. So that is how the world saw Jesus in his day. Dangerous, defeated, disposal. And that's how many see him today too. A character from the dim, distant past, long forgotten. Someone whose ideas are out of step, on the wrong side of history. Someone to be left behind. That might be what our friends or family think. It might be deep down what we think about Jesus. Condemned, despised. The Jewish leaders, they don't get to do what they want here. They don't wield the sword like Rome does, and yet they've managed to orchestrate the death of Jesus. He has long been a threat to their influence and their authority, and most of all, to their place in the pecking order. And they've been worried ever since Jesus' rise to popularity that if he stirs up a crowd and the Romans crack down, they will lose maybe even the temple itself. You can see that back in chapter 11. And without a temple, how could we be made clean? They sort of get the problem, don't they? And so they hatch a plan to hand Jesus over as a political traitor, and it takes a bit of persuading, but eventually Rome does their dirty work for them. But if you notice in verse 31, that presents a problem. Even when Jesus is dead, he's a problem for the religious leaders, because as we're told, it is the day of preparation. That's the day preparing for the Passover. And the next day was to be a special Sabbath. And remembering that the Sabbath begins at sundown, they've got to move quickly. Jesus has died at probably around 3 in the afternoon. I've only got a few hours to sort out this problem. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Jesus' crucifixion was never meant to happen now. It was meant to be later, so they didn't run into this problem. The Passover is supposed to be the holiest day of the whole Jewish year. The day they remember God's salvation out of Egypt. How he passed over their sin and saved them from judgment and redeemed them from slavery. And now, right before that's meant to happen, there is a condemned man on a Roman cross just outside their holy city. And so Jesus is still a problem. In Deuteronomy 21, we're told why. If someone guilty of a capital offence is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse, and you must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. The Romans don't care about this, but the Jews do. This man on the cross isn't just condemned, he's cursed. And if he stays there, the whole land will be contaminated. It's the night before Passover. Jerusalem is swelled, much like Melbourne does, grand final week. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims are here to offer sacrifices and be made clean, and one condemned man hanging on a cross will ruin it all for everyone. There will be no way to be made clean. So he was condemned by Rome, but he was contaminated for the Jews, which is why they ask in verses 31 for his legs to be broken, and why in verse 32 the soldiers come, breaking the legs of the men on either side. It's a dreadful situation, and an even worse solution. If you were being crucified, the only way to breathe is to be able to leverage your feet with a great big spike through it, to be able to push up for as long as the pain would allow. That's all you could do to open your chest and be able to breathe. Break your legs and you'll suffocate. It is brutal, but it's quick. And to these religious guys, it seems a great way to keep the Sabbath clean. How dreadful. That their great concern would be, how can we make sure he's dead? Jesus is condemned by an empire as a threat to its ruler, condemned by the priests as a threat to the temple. In the eyes of the law, he is under the curse of God himself. And yet he is the most innocent man who has ever lived, treated as the most dangerous, as the most unclean, as the most cursed. From every angle, Roman, Jewish, he is a problem to be removed. But friends, the truth is, he was never a traitor, and we are. He was never disobedient to the Father who made everything. And yet God has given us life, and we rebel against him. Jesus never crowned himself as King of the Jews, and we crown ourselves every day as the King or Queen in our life, as the one who must be obeyed or pleased. We are the rebels who deserve to be in Jesus' place. And he came to take our place instead. See, his death was not only an execution, it was a sacrifice. It wasn't an accident. He came to bear our curse, to be crushed to make us clean. Which brings us to our second and final point, verses 33 to 37, where we find that Jesus is dead and able to make us clean. The soldiers, verse 32, finish with the men on either side breaking their legs. But in verse 33, when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. These guys are the experts. They've seen many people dead before in battle or at other executions. They know the difference between someone who's still dying and someone who is dead already. And so they don't do what they were sent to do, fulfilling that prophecy mentioned in verse 36 from Psalms. Not one of his bones will be broken, Psalm 32. David had taught God's people to sing of God's salvation. In the verses surrounding this, the righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones. Not one of them will be broken. It was God's promise that Jesus' bones would stay intact, because he is the ultimate righteous one. He is the ultimate obedient Son of God. Not a cursed criminal. This is God's declaration of Jesus' innocence and his proof that he is the spotless sacrifice who can take our place. Just a couple of verses earlier, in verse 30 that Callum read for us, we see how Jesus died. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. But his death is not like the death of a defeated criminal. This is not grim resistance fighting to the end. This is not worn-out surrender. Jesus entrusted his spirit to God the Father because his work was complete. No one else does that. No one else can. Every other political or religious leader one day is overtaken by death, but not Jesus. Jesus grabs death by the throat and defeats it. Jesus crushes the evil serpent under his foot. Jesus removes the sting of death so it can no longer harm anyone else who is in him. Here is the defeat of death in the death of Jesus. So instead of breaking Jesus' legs, verse 34, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Here's medical proof, if we needed it, that Jesus is truly dead. The spear would have gone into his chest and must have punctured the pericardium, where the blood would have pooled as he was suffocating and dying. If you leave it long enough, I'm told the serum rises to the top. It's pretty clear. The darker blood sits at the bottom, and it will come out, as John describes here, like the flow of blood and water. Clearly, Jesus' death was true. Let no one tell you that after most of a day on a cross, Jesus had a nice little rest in a cold tomb and got up feeling much better, thank you, a few days later. Lies. Ridiculous lies. What's happening here is the fulfillment of the prophecy John mentions in verse 37 from Zechariah. As God promises both judgment and grace for his holy city, Jerusalem. Zechariah 12 verse 10, they will look on me, the one they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. It's a moment of recognition there, isn't it? That we pierced him. That he died because of us. And yet Zechariah isn't done with God's words of judgment and grace. A few verses later in chapter 13, verse 1, he says, on that day, a fountain will be opened. What do you need a fountain for? What do you need fresh water for? To cleanse them. To make them clean from sin and impurity, the prophets say. Just as out of the wound blood and water flow, signs of cleansing and life, so God promised through Zechariah, so God brought about in the Lord Jesus a fountain of grace. As the hymn writer said, there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. Cleansing from guilt for all who believe, for all who repent and turn to Christ, even those in the crowd who cried, crucify him, could be washed clean. Because Jesus finished the guilt of sin for us. Friends, this same cleansing grace is here for his people today. Notice why John says these things are written. We mentioned it earlier, but again in verse 35. He wrote these things. He testifies so that you also may believe. We weren't at the cross that dark afternoon, but John was. And he is saying, as he writes some years later, friends, this can be for you as well, if you believe. Not just knowing and understanding that it happened, but trusting it is for you. For you who need cleansing. For you who need forgiveness. For you who need to be reconciled with a holy God just like I do. To believe, friends, and to go on believing that all God wrote and promised was done in Jesus, died and cleansed. This is so much more than having some rules to show us a good way of life, than seeking harmony with the universe or spiritual enlightenment somehow. This is the grace he promised, the mercy that reconciles us from sin, the forgiveness that cleanses our guilt and shame. So can we say the words of trust in Jesus? Can we express from our hearts the certainty that this is us? When we sing, are these words true? It was my sin that held him until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. Is that what you believe, friends? So at the end of John's Gospel, he makes exactly the same point, the very next chapter. Writing of all that he records in the Gospel, he says, "These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." That Jesus' death is what secures forgiveness and life for me and you. Not just knowing, but depending. Whether you have heard of Jesus recently, whether you've been hearing about him all your life, today do you believe in him? It's the most important question we could ask. What will we do with Jesus who died? See, the rabbi and the imam and the Taoist master and the Buddhist guru, all of their guys died too. And that's the beginning of the end. But if you are a Christian, you can say, yes, our guy died. But it was impossible for death to hold him. It was not an accident, but the plan of God, who then declared him to be the Son of God with power by his resurrection from the dead. That Jesus was cursed to make us clean, condemned to make us acceptable, who died that we would live. Friends, then we don't have to pretend that we've kept the 10 Commandments. We don't have to meditate long enough that we've conned ourselves into forgetting everyone who's unhappy with us, let alone the God who made us. We can be set free from the power of sin and from its penalty, and continue to fight against it until one day we're free of its presence in his new creation. Friends, if you are a believer in Jesus who died, then live in the power of his death. As we read from Romans 8, there is nothing else to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, who makes us conquerors in him. Do you trust Jesus, who died to make us